Hello and welcome to I Miss Book Club. I'm your host, Veronica Reynolds, and I'm joined once again by my sometimes co-host, Joe Barbieri. Welcome back,
Hi
Joe.
Hi, Veronica. Glad to be here again. I'm so eager. I'm trying to talk over you already.
Totally fine. Love that for us, because I'm going to be talking quite a lot, so, jump in as you have questions and thoughts. An interesting topic, I think, anyway, this week. I wanted to talk about Alexander Dumas and his father, very briefly about his son. It's a tale of three Alexander Dumas, only one of whom was named that at birth. And the reason I wanted to talk about Dumas is I think that he is an author that most people know of, if not about, from Three Musketeers, Count of Monte Cristo. Those are his most famous books. But I don't think people know that he is mixed race.
Yeah.
And so I know February is African American History Month. Obviously, Dumas is not American. He's French. But I think his story is interesting to highlight in that he is a famous person who I think has mostly had his race erased from history, even though it certainly impacted his career. It was almost certainly one of the reasons that we get some of the stories that we get from him. So I thought he was an interesting guy to discuss.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it never really comes up in the conversation. Here he is, this author of all these classics, yet it never comes up.
Yeah, and one of the questions I got asked when I first presented about Dumas, someone said, well, do you think it affected him at the time? And spoiler alert, yeah, he experienced a ton of racism, even though he was extremely famous. I think it's also good to remember that things happen outside of our borders as well. And while other places were better, they certainly also have race struggles in other countries too. And France was certainly struggling with this. When I lay out the time frame of what was happening with his father, you might get some of the picture that I'm going to paint. It's some interesting stuff. So do you have any other intro questions before we get rocking and rolling?
I will preface this by saying, okay, so full disclosure here, The Count of Monte Cristo is one of my favorite books. It is this great, it's this epic, it's really, really long, especially if you don't read an abridged version. All these intersecting characters, you really do need a chart to keep track of everyone. Some of his other works I'm familiar with, the basic story, but not as deeply as that story. But I mean, that story has a little bit of everything. Intrigue. There's the whole with politics at the time, the historical fiction. It plays right into that. I mean, personal connections. There's a whole revenge plot. There's romance and action. It's got a little bit of everything. It really is. He's just such a great storyteller, and there's something there for everyone in the audience. And I think that's probably why but now I'm ready to learn what in life influenced this guy to become such a great storyteller.
So I'm so excited that you say that, because that's why I like to talk about his father, because I'm going to tell you a story about an amazing person. And by the end of the time I'm done telling you about his father, Joe, if you have not keyed in to some interesting facts as a Count of Monte Cristo lover, I would be shocked, because I have a thesis about Dumas and his writing that I would love to share. So just to get underway, I am going to show Joe a picture, which obviously you, the listener, cannot see, but I do recommend you Google if you get a chance. Joe, do you want to describe the painting that I've just put on screen for you?
Oh, sure. So we are looking at it's a portrait on horseback. There is a name, there is a fancy art history term, I'm sure, for this. I don't know, maybe it's an equestrian or something. It's basically your classic war hero atop of the horse, and he's got this sword saber out, and it looks like we're mid battle. There's smoke all around. The horse is up in an action pose. And on top, we've got this pretty confident-looking fella up there. He's got the saber out. He's ready to go. He's got the French flag colors on his hat and on his, I don't know what you'd call that. He's wearing some kind of
a bandolier, maybe.
Yeah. Sash around kind of his waist there. So Yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about this person on top of this? In this,
Yes, because I think very, very worth noting as well as this man's skin color is very clearly brown. He is not a white person, which is not as common as it usually is in paintings of this type in this very Western portraiture. I'm going to try my best. I took 8 years of French, and my French is still terrible, so please excuse my horrible pronunciation. But this is Thomas Alexander Dumas Davy de Palater. And his life is pretty fascinating. He's born to the Marquis Antoine Alexander Davy de Palater, and a woman that we know for sure was called Marie Sauzette, who may or may not have had the last name Dumas. She was an enslaved woman, and she was specifically enslaved to his father. So he is a child born of, I don't think, to put too fine a point on it, I don't think you can have consensual sex with someone you technically own. So he is the child of this horrible union. We don't know anything about how Marie Sauzette herself felt about it. Her feelings are lost to time, but she did have 3 children with the Marquis. He was not at the time the Marquis. He was like a Marquis in waiting. And of course, this was not unusual at the time. And Thomas Alexander is born into what was then called Saint Domingue, but is current day Haiti. A lot of space in the Caribbean that was owned by the French as well, and a lot of plantations and a lot of slave ownership. So this was not an unusual story. However, what is interesting is that Thomas himself is never treated as a slave. He is treated as a son of this eventual Marquis. He's raised on the tobacco and coffee plantation. His sisters are very much treated as slaves, as far as I can tell from the research. They are, in fact, sold off at one point along with his mother and then repurchased later to pay for a debt. So I can't imagine the cognitive dissonance happening there. That must have been really painful. But in 1776, he goes to France to live with his father. His father has gone back to become Marquis officially and assume the title. Thomas goes with him, and again, he is treated like a son. He does not get the family surname, which it's hard to tell because, of course, the records are foggy. But it's possible that's by his choice, and I'll get into why. But we certainly know that he chooses the name Dumas, which he claims to be his mother's name. We don't have any documentation of that being his mother's last name, but he says it is, so we'll take him at his word. And that is what he puts on his own marriage license, that was his mother's maiden name and that's his name. Sometimes some people think he might have made it up on the spot just to distance himself more from his father. So to give you an idea, he travels to France in 1776. Slavery is fully abolished in France and in the French colonies in 1795. So slavery is still actively happening. When they do that, the law is passed with a caveat that the slave owners are repaid for the loss of their slaves. So we're not seeing this still really, it's not abolition in that we fully conceive of these people as people, it's just that we don't want to have slaves anymore. So that's not great. But Napoleon, notably, slavery has been abolished. The slave trade has not been. The slave trade is not abolished until 1850. Thomas Alexander will have been dead for almost 10 years at that point. So throughout his whole life, France is still involved in the slave trade, if not outright in owning slaves. So it's important to know that that's happening simultaneously while what the rest of goes on is happening. There is a really important incident that happens regarding his race. In September 1784, he takes a young lady to the theater. The young lady is white, and he is obviously not. A white West Indian officer, Jean-Pierre Titon de Saint-Lamaine, insults him by pretending to mistake him as the lady's lackey. They have a fight. Titon wins. They force Thomas Alexander to kneel in front of his assailant and make him beg for forgiveness. The police arrive. They take everyone into custody. They take everyone's statements. Nothing comes of it. Notably, Alexander Dumas, or the man we're actually in question today, talks about this story 50 years later. In his story, his father's race is never mentioned. His father wins the fight, and he throws his assailant into the orchestra.
Oh, wow.
The only reason we know that's not the story is the police records actually. I mean, we have the statements made by both Thomas Alexander and his assailant intact.
Yeah.
So that's how we know the actual story.
Okay.
They feel a little familiar.
Yeah.
Fortunately, very little changes.
Yeah. But what a horrible thing for a member of society. You know, the theater isn't just the theater at this time. And if you read some of the Dumas stories, you know that it's that must have been all the who's who of the city were probably right there to see this. So you understand how damaging this must have been, you know, to a person's psyche to have this happen in front of everyone, because the impression that you get when you read a story like The Count of Monte Cristo is that society doesn't go to the theater to see the performance. They're there to see everyone else and gossip about everyone else. So for this to happen right smack dab, you know, an incident like this, so you can bet that this was a very, very
formative, right?
Moment. Yeah.
And he's pretty young. So within 2 years of that incident, and one must assume probably other incidents like it that just aren't as recorded, he decides to give up his family name. The story that seems to come out on top when you read through a lot of different biographies is that his father told him, if you join the military, you can't use our name because you'll be joining too low in the ranks and it would be embarrassing. And he says, fine, I'll be Dumas instead. That's the story that seems to rise to the top. There are some contradictory things that I found in the research, but that seems to be what comes in. So he joins the military. He's a corporal in 1792 when France goes to war with Austria and Prussia. So this is all happening during like the Napoleonic Wars. There's a new legion founded. It's called the Black Legion. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with skin color. I think it was just the French like to name their legion's colors. It's formed in 1792 as well, and he's promoted very quickly to lieutenant colonel and becomes second in command. So again, he's not using his aristocratic name. This is purely on whatever he was doing out there was impressing people.
Okay.
The head of this unit, Saint Georges, was born in Guadeloupe, and like Dumas, was also mixed ethnicity. But he wasn't that interested in the army, but he trusted Dumas, so he left him in charge. The Black Legion goes to fight with the Army of the North, and Dumas gets, again, promoted to the General of Brigade in 1793. It's a year, and he's got corporal to general.
Yeah.
And that's not normal. It was notable even then. He does make some kind of mistake in 1794, which should have brought him to a tribunal, but then the Reign of Terror starts, so nobody cares about that anymore.
They've got other things on their mind, yeah.
Right. By 1796, he's serving under Napoleon himself. In 1798, he gets to go to Egypt. So Napoleon famously tries to conquer Egypt, right? So he actually he sends Thomas Alexander and a couple other high-level guys ahead of him. So Thomas Alexander's kicking around Egypt for a while, and he is such a commanding presence. He's very tall and strong and presumably pretty charismatic. He's such a commanding presence that people think he's the commander, and when Napoleon shows up, they refuse to believe that Napoleon's actually in charge. Thomas Alexander just looks like he should be in charge. You saw that painting. He looks like a very presence.
He looked very comfortable, you know, on that horse.
Oh yeah, he looks like he's got this. So people just didn't believe it. And of course, it's the desert. Nothing's all that pleasant. A lot of them meet up, a lot of the leadership, to complain about Napoleon. And this gets back to Napoleon, who, as you know, was super level-headed about it.
Of course, yeah.
There's a big brouhaha, and it's ultimately decided that Thomas will leave because he's also not feeling particularly well. They're going to make it a medical leave. So he's kind of like honorably discharged for medical purposes at this point.
Okay.
On the way home, they have this. Get your listening ears on. Here comes the stuff you may want to pay attention to. So on the return home, they have to land in Naples. When they had left France, Naples had just put in an interim government that would have been friendly towards the French. What they don't know when they land in Naples is the old government has been reinstated while they were incommunicado. They take everyone on board prisoner.
Ooh.
Dumas is malnourished. He does not speak to anybody from home for 2 years. By the time of his release, he is partially paralyzed. He's almost blind in one eye. And he believes that he was poisoned during his time in prison. While he's in prison, he is aided by a local pro-French group. They bring him medicine and remedies, but it's the late 1700s, and the medicine and remedies they have clearly aren't that great anyway.
Yeah.
In November of 1799, Napoleon goes back to Paris. He seizes power, and Dumas' wife back home lobbies for government assistance in finding and rescuing her husband. But as you can imagine, Napoleon is still mad, and he does not do that. Unrelatedly, Napoleon's forces do go in. They eventually defeat the army that's involved in Napoleon. I'm not getting into the Napoleonic Wars. If you're interested, you can look it up. But Dumas is released in March 1801, kind of peripherally. It's not the intention of anybody. It's just one of the outcomes. So he has been in prison for several years, and he is very unwell. Does that sound?
I was going to say, this is some good, this is some good exposition for a story. What do you know?
Right. So I mentioned his wife. I could not find a lot about her. Her name's Marie Louise Laborde. She was born in 1769. She was an innkeeper's daughter. She stayed behind when Dumas went on his military campaigns, but he bought her 30 acres of land to live on. They also had 3 children. 2 daughters, and then a son. The son is R. Alexander Dumas.
Okay.
Which, talk more about him in a minute. After he gained his release, Dumas does not get the pension that normally goes to generals of the French government. He really struggles to support his family, and he repeatedly writes to Napoleon trying to seek back pay for the time lost and for a new commission in the military, even though he's pretty profoundly ill. He dies of stomach cancer in 1806. They have virtually no money, and that brings us to Alexander. So like I said, there's only one Alexander Dumas in the story who's born Alexander Dumas. It's not this one. He's born Dumas Davy de Pelletier.
Okay.
And he is born in the same year as his contemporary Victor Hugo, a name that some of you may recognize out there. Well, he wrote some kind of known stuff,
Yeah.
Little Les Mis.
Yeah.
That becomes important because they are very parallel in their careers. So they're born the same year, they're the same age. Poor and fatherless by age 4, Dumas helps out his family by literally scavenging in the woods for mushrooms and plants, anything edible. They're very poor. Unable to afford schooling, his mother teaches him alone at home, and one of the things that she teaches him are all the stories of his father's glory.
Yeah.
The way he was wronged is very focused on, because obviously they are living in the consequences of all of that.
Mm-hmm.
At age 13, I love this anecdote, Dumas gets his first desire for celebrity after an older friend writes a funny epigram. You know how it is when someone writes a funny epigram. And people repeated it everywhere. And Dumas said, I must admit that all of the brouhaha around his name made my head spin. I wanted the glory of having others speak of me, even when I wasn't there. So he's only 13. He already knows he wants to be famous. He wants to be a YouTuber. He wants to be an epigram YouTuber.
Yeah.
For a while, his mom is able to scratch together some money. They send him to this little provincial religious school, which they call a college, mostly just to kind of confer some importance on it. But it's basically just one dude, an abbé, who Dumas describes as poor dear abbé, whom we have made so unhappy, whom we have made so enraged, who scolded us so loudly, and who loved us so much. Aww. So he enjoyed his time at school, but unfortunately they ran out of money.
Okay.
But happily for Dumas, the monarchy is restored. You may have noticed there's a lot of political upheaval happening here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's that's also how the stories go too. There's always it's who's in power, and things can turn on a dime, and that can that definitely influence from real life as well.
France at this time is just full of these things. So he's definitely observing things. So I'm going to share another picture because I want you to see young Dumas.
Okay.
This is a little sketch. Do you see the sketch here?
Yeah. Oh, he's in a jacket. He's kind of looking like a dandy, and he's on a kind of lounging on a couch. And he looks like I'd say he's somewhat well dressed. But he looks like he's just hanging out, relaxing on this couch here in this sketch.
I think he looks very charismatic. There's like you can feel that whoever's drawing him is intending to draw him to be handsome. There's like they're trying to draw attention to him, which I think is very flattering. The drawing is by After Achille de Veria. I could not find much else out about that person, but I don't think I dug all that deeply, in fairness. The nice thing about Dumas is we actually have photographs of him, because when he was living, they had like the very early like daguerreotypes. So I'll show you those as well.
Oh, cool.
So he has one skill, which is that he has really nice handwriting. So he trains, right. So he trains as a notary. He goes to Paris in 1822, and he likes it a lot. So when he comes home, he gambles and he wins billiards, and he wins 600 glasses of absinthe, which he trades for money.
Okay, I was going to say, I guess that's currency to somebody.
Right, and he gets 12 round-trip tickets by coach to Paris, and he uses that for a while, and he moves permanently to Paris the next year. And he starts working for the Duke of Paris of Orleans as a notary.
Okay.
He starts also reading a lot because he's told that he's not very educated. People who are from the same walk of life are like, you need to read more because you don't know what's going on. He also has what will be the first of many affairs. So when I say affair, he is not yet married. So this affair just meaning I think the woman might have been married, unclear.
Oh, okay, so yeah.
But he has an affair with Marie Laurie Catherine Lebay, who's a seamstress, and has his first child, who he does named after himself. He gives him his last name. So that is the first actual Alexander Dumas named at birth. And in France, they are often referred to as Alexander Dumas Père. That's our author of Count of Monte Cristo and the Three Musketeers, and Alexander Dumas Fils, son. And the reason they're distinguished is that Fils also goes on to become an author, so you have to distinguish between them. But meanwhile, while he's out fathering sons, Dumas is also doing a lot of other stuff. He's getting involved in the local political scene, and he starts to write. And he produces his first plays in 1829. His very first one is called Henry III and His Court. He's 27 years old.
Okay.
The content, I love this, at its premiere, its content was so revolutionary that it caused a near riot, with his young friends chanting "Down with Racine, down with Voltaire," and trying to heave marble busts of classical authors out the foyer windows.
Oh, wow. Okay, so there's some immediate reaction.
It makes me think of the Macbeth riots. I don't know if you ever heard of this in Manhattan in like the turn of the century as well. They performed Macbeth, and there was two rival productions of Macbeth going on at the same time. It caused a riot. Like, people died.
Oh, wow.
People used to riot at the theater a lot, apparently. But he had his finger on the pulse of the local politics, and he was interested in it. So he was writing stuff that was revolutionary in the sense of trying to cause a revolution. In 1830, he participates in the revolution that ousts Charles X and replaces him with Dumas' former employer, the Duke of Orleans, who eventually ruled as Louis Philippe, the citizen king. Only little problem was that while Dumas did want the revolution, he did not actually back the Duke of Orleans in that revolution. He voted for somebody else, and the Duke of Orleans obviously knew him personally and knew that. So Dumas did what I like to call as like a little voluntary exile. No one told him to leave. He's just politically very savvy, and he's like, what if I was just not here for a couple of years? So he'd already written 2 or 3 plays that were like pretty well established. He'd already made enough money that he didn't have to do anything but write plays for a living. Pretty good deal.
Okay. Yeah.
So he goes out and he travels, and he writes travelogues, which are also very well received, and they're very witty. So he does that for a few years. The issue Dumas has, and will have throughout his life, is he loves to spend money. He spends more than he makes.
Yeah.
He likes to live very extravagantly. He loves good food. He's actually quite an accomplished cook himself. He loves beautiful clothes. He loves women. So he lives this very large life. So he needs to make large money. And he's also quite savvy with business. One of the things I like about Dumas is, to me, he feels like a 19th century influencer. Like, he figured out not just like the writing component of this, but like marketing himself as a product a little bit. So one of the things that he hooks into, he does not invent but sees coming as important is serial novelization. Do you know about serial novelization, Joe?
Yeah. So, I think at this time, and this is me just, putting on my little history hat here, I would say that we probably have a lot of newspapers and periodicals growing.
Correct.
And one way to sell your periodical or your little newspaper or your regular, installment is to get folks to and keep on buying it every day, week, what have you, is to have this little continuation, this little story that continues on, and chapter by chapter it will unravel, and that's how we get these very long yarns by these 19th century authors. Is that these works were originally serialized, right?
Correct. And more than daily or weekly, there was a movement at this time in the press to sell annual subscriptions. So you had to prove that there was something valuable in there, right? So serial novelization in France really catches on with this. Important to note, famous serial novelist Charles Dickens, if anyone's curious of what that reads like. If you've read a Dickens novel, that was serialized. Becomes important because the style of writing tends to be a hook at the end of the chapter, so you'll often get lots of cliffhangers, which is odd when you're reading it all at once. Yeah. But that's why you get those kind of things. And sometimes a resummation, like if you've ever read like an 1800s book, and you're like, why do they keep summing things up? Well, probably because you hadn't read it in a month. And
yeah, just last time on...
right? Yeah, very soapy, right?
Yeah.
So Dumas' first stab at this, he writes Le Comtesse de Salisbury, Edward III, in 1836. And then he rewrites one of his plays into a successful serial novel 2 years after that. And then he founds a production studio. He staffs writers who turn out hundreds of stories, all under his personal direction, with editing and additions that he puts in. So he kind of makes his own version of this.
Oh, wow.
Pretty quickly. I mean, he's done about 2 of these, and he's like, I get it, I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
And then I love this bit. From 1839 to 1941, with the assistance of friends, Dumas compiles Celebrated Crimes, an 8-volume collection of essays on famous criminals and crimes from European history. This guy is so trendy. He's on the true crime movement.
Yeah, I was going to say that comparison to the influences of the day. That's really he really is ahead of his time there. He knows what how to hook people, and how to.
I would have had not just a podcast, he would have had a suite of podcasts. He would have been one of those podcast umbrellas that produces 20.
Yeah. And
you're like, how many hours do you have in the day? You're on 20 podcasts.
Yes, while simultaneously plugging all the other,
Right, podcasts. I'm also on this other one. So he puts that together. And then in collaboration with his fencing master, because fencing was very popular among the rich, that's the thing that you did. And of course, Dumas wanted to move in that echelon of folks, regardless of his actual personal wealth at any given time.
Yeah.
But he was learning to fence. He writes a novel called The Fencing Master, and he and Grazier and him are great friends for the rest of his life. And then he really gets in, the novels really start coming. He writes The Knight of Harmental. In 1943, he publishes 2 books, including George, which we'll get back to. And then it's the big year. It's 1844. And he publishes The Three Musketeers, A Daughter of the Regent, The Count of Monte Cristo, Queen Margot, all one after the other. And 2 of those, of course, wind up being his biggest hits of all time.
Yeah.
Some of the books are written in collaboration, which we'll get to. As are some of his plays. So let's talk about The Count of Monte Cristo. I won't sum up the plot because you did that admirably at the beginning, but it's basically a vengeance plot for wrongful imprisonment, right? The book has been translated into virtually all modern languages and has never been out of print in most of them.
Wow.
Yeah. There have been at least 29 motion pictures based on it.
Okay, it's like I said, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but there's something in it for everybody, so I understand why.
I think it's incredible. So Dumas himself, 20 years after the publication of Count of Monte Cristo, claims that he went sailing with a cousin of the future Emperor Napoleon III and promised that cousin that he would write a book with Monte Cristo in the title because the future emperor at the time was imprisoned in Monte Cristo. We don't know that that's true, but that is the story that he told, and why not? We might as well believe him. The interesting thing is, despite that story, the novel has no interest in the political situation at the time and does not talk about it at all. It is also arguably to me the book that is so clearly a fantasy retelling of his father's life, this wrongful imprisonment, except that his father gets the story he should have had, where he gets the money, he gets the girl, he gets revenge against every single person who ever harmed him. It's such an interesting intergenerational wish fulfillment.
Yeah. Now knowing what we learned today, it's like, oh wow, all of these things are just, well, here's how, it should have gone for Dad.
Right? And the worst part is, I shouldn't say it's not the worst part. Interesting. Strike worst.
Yeah.
None of the protagonists of his main books are mixed race. Yeah. And they are not portrayed that way in any of those 29 films until very, very recently, the last few, maybe. So he also just takes that out of the picture and does not contend with it. We don't know why. I mean, one could guess commercial success meant that he couldn't do that. But it's interesting. He just removes that from the picture entirely as a complicating factor.
Yeah.
So the other one that everybody knows, we got The Three Musketeers, which also has almost the same amount of movie adaptations, if not more. It actually probably has more because there's a lot of things that are like loosely based on the Three Musketeers, but don't call themselves the Three Musketeers. We get the all for one and one for all phrase, which everyone has said at some point in their life, I feel. It's written in collaboration with Auguste Maquet, who will also work on him with all the sequels, as well as the Count of Monte Cristo. I'm going to get back to Maquet. Pin him for later.
All right.
I am not going to go into, I have some quotations here, but for the sake of time, we'll leave those aside. But let's talk about Dumas himself. What's going on with him at this time? So at the height of his fame, which is arguably around this time, he builds a castle, as you do, called the Chateau de Monte Cristo.
Okay, very on the nose there, but hey, right. That's you gotta recognize where your success comes from, right?
Right. And he has to sell it within 4 years because he spends all the money. Around this time, he is married to an actress named Ida Ferrier. I could not find anywhere how long this marriage lasted. It's not clear if they stayed married, but it clearly didn't leave much of an impression on the historical record. Let's put it that way that I could find.
A celebrity marriage not lasting very long?
Shocking, especially when I tell you this next bit. So while there's no telling the exact number, he definitely had many mistresses. I mean, it's France, so France at this time, like, if you didn't have a mistress, it was weird. Like, that was like kind of a given. We have at least 4 documented illegitimate children, but various sources suggest there was more than that. So I say various sources. I just want to put a pin in this, because as I was reading this, you cannot believe how people will take something and run, right? Yeah. I read in one place that he had 72 mistresses. Okay, he was one human man, you tell me. I think it's one of those things where these things get taken out of context, they get exaggerated. I think racism plays a hand in it, that people want to drum the stuff up. He was definitely someone who had a lot of women in his life. It was documented, but not 72. That seems unlikely. But he definitely had a couple of, we know about 4 of the children for sure. And he seemed to have recognized them and even had a hand in raising those 4 kids. Like, he wasn't a guy who like left them to languish on the streets, as far as I can tell. Especially, I mean, Alexandre Dumas lived with him, and 2 of his daughters lived with him at the end of his life. So he was involved in their lives.
Yeah.
Now here's a fun one for you. Artists always going to artist regardless of period. Ready for this influencer moment?
Okay.
Along with Victor Hugo, Charles Baudelaire, Gerard de Nerval, Eugene Delacroix, and Honoré de Balzac. A couple of good names for you there.
Yeah.
He was a member of a club called Club de Hachines. What do you think that they got up to?
I'm guessing they got into some substance use.
Correct. They met monthly at a hotel to take hashish.
And there's, I mean, that's kind of a plot point, in our if you look back at Count of Monte Cristo, definitely a couple, subplots hinge around the use of hashish there. So, exactly, coming right from real life.
But I love that artist gonna artist. This
Yeah.
group of guys, all extremely famous in their day. Some of them still famous now. They hung out and smoked hash together, like in a hotel room, and they had a club name. It was very official. So I'm also going to show you a portrait of Dumas from around this time. This is a painting.
Okay.
So you can see him here. Let me go a little larger for you.
There he is.
There he is. I'm using like a red.
He's looking very distinguished, but if you ask me, I would say we've definitely done a little bit of whitewashing in this depiction.
I would agree compared to the other depiction that you saw, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Slightly whitewashed. He does, I will say, have a great expression on his face where one of his eyebrows is slightly raised above the other.
Oh, like he looks like an intriguing guy. Like you want to go up and ask him about life for sure. Don't get me wrong, but yeah.
Yeah, and he has a really great halo of black curls, natural curls. Yeah. He looks pretty good here. He looks pretty happy. I will say one of the things I love about Dumas is I'll show you some of the photographs when we get there. He always in the photos, like photos from that time, everyone looks very dour because of how long he had to hold still.
Mm.
He actually always looks kind of like he's about to like break out in a huge grin, which I love. There's something.
Yeah, I feel like the picture that I've seen, which is probably like just the picture that comes up when you look him up at Wikipedia.
Yeah,
he looks like he is ready to break out, like just flash you the biggest grin, or just start laughing like a really just jolly guy, or somebody told a really good joke and it's that split second before he's going to break out into laughter because he's at a party and somebody just told him a goofy story that he's going to turn into some kind of
anecdote. Yeah, later.
His other stories.
he looks like someone you want to spend time with. Like there's something very inviting about him in his pictures, which I love. All right, so now we can take the pin out and we can talk about Auguste Maquet. So Auguste Maquet was his longest running collaborator, although he had others. He was a trained historian. He worked alongside for Dumas for about 20 years.
Okay.
So this is a great story of why you need to pay people. Because frankly, they probably could have gone on forever if it wasn't for the fact that Dumas stopped paying Maquet. Okay. And once you don't pay somebody, now they're mad and now they're going to do something about it. So according to Dumas, the writing process, he always said he had collaborators. He did not hide that. His writing process was that Maquet would like present him with like a list of historical facts about something interesting, maybe even like a slight outline. And then Dumas would take that like historical story and fictionalize it and make it fun and interesting and put it in his voice, essentially.
Okay.
He is turning out by the later part of his career just massive amounts of fiction. He creates upwards of 73 works in his lifetime.
Okay, so he's churning them out.
And we know that he worked really long days, like that. Nobody ever accused him of not working. This is not a thing where there's like, oh, he didn't do anything. He worked really hard. He would write for up to 14 hours a day, but he also like did publicity tours, and was what I like to call, quote unquote, the face of the Dumas brand, because he would be like out there, like almost hand selling his stuff by just being himself, because people are like, oh, what an interesting guy. And they'd be like, well, did you know he's an author? That kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Whereas Maquet was kind of a more of like, he's a historian, he has the facts, but he doesn't have that charisma, certainly. Mm. So in 1958, he starts suing Dumas for back payments and to get more credit for their joint work. He accuses Dumas of essentially doing almost nothing to his work and then putting his name on it.
No.
Which, again, you can come down in either way on this. You can make your own judgment. I would just say 20 years is a long time to labor under somebody with no credit, and you kind of wonder why it didn't come up before he stopped paying him.
Yeah.
I suspect the money was the bigger resentment, but that's just my personal interpretation. Luckily for Dumas, the courts find in his favor.
Okay.
They rule that, Maquet is the fact finder, the credit of the work should be to Dumas. And they very publicly have a falling out. I would say almost like a divorce. It's pretty ugly. Interestingly enough, after they separate, neither man ever produces a work that's regarded at the same level of anything that they did together.
Huh.
They say of Maquette's work that it is Dumas-like afterwards, but I say to that, okay, what else would you like it to be like? He's been writing with this man for 20 years.
Yeah, yeah.
He's not suddenly going to find his own voice, I think. I mean, maybe, but it seems unlikely. But people like to point to that if you're on Maquette's side, that like, oh, obviously he was writing this stuff. I find it hard to believe. We kind of know that Dumas was a pretty long and tireless worker himself. But in any collaboration, who's to say who's lifting more weight? The only people who know are the two men themselves. So that's where we leave that. To circle all the way back, though, to race, I put a pin in a book called Georges, which he writes in 1843, Dumas. And in that book, George is the son of a mulatto. That word is very out of fashion, and I apologize for using it. That's just the word that gets used in the book. Planter on Mauritius, and he seeks retribution for his brave but scorned father. Later in the book, he himself leads a slave revolt. So Count of Monte Cristo and the Three Musketeers are totally shorn of race. Star leads who are like Dumas' father are given better outcomes. They get their revenge, they escape. They're always the hero. And George is the hero, but it's the only book where Dumas writes about a mixed race experience that he himself lives through. Even at the height of his fame, Dumas experiences racism and was constantly referred to as quote unquote the Negro in the same breath as someone extolling his work. And just to drive home, it would be bad regardless, but do remember, Dumas is only a quarter African.
Yeah.
It's just the all of the horrible things that wind up happening in America with the 3 drops and all of that stuff is just as prevalent in France at this time. It's Dumas is the first in his family to live in a time when the country they live in is not actively enslaving African people.
Yeah.
So he's obviously experiencing this. And one of the times that he's quoted a lot, somebody who was white is insulting him for being mixed race. It was probably another writer. And his big comeback was this. You can decide if you think it was a good one or not. This is his quote. These are his words, not mine. My father was a mulatto, my grandfather was a Negro, and my great-grandfather a monkey. You see, sir, my family starts where yours ends.
Ooh.
Pretty good burn.
Yeah.
I think. It's still, though, you can see the internalized racism of that as well.
Yeah.
It's a hard... I only bring up these quotes because I think it's important to let people speak for themselves in these moments. And it's one of the few times we have Dumas actually talking about his race himself.
Yeah, and it's just interesting because, it is something that he definitely had to live with, literally every day, and as a member of, French society, and that, as a writer and a creator. Yeah, and lots of times, like you said, he does have to kind of push that under the rug. So, it is interesting when we get to hear a direct quote about that.
He also attempts to run for public office a couple of times, and it's pretty clear from even the historical record that at least once he was rejected from even running because of the color of his skin. So when people say, does racism impact Alexander Dumas and his work? Yeah, absolutely. But it does, even when he's not talking about it directly. I think that whole theme that he keeps coming back to of revenge, I mean, he has a lot to feel vengeful about, I think. And what's awful to think about is this is a guy who actually has a tremendous amount of privilege because he's very famous.
Yeah.
His books are beloved. Yeah. He's very well liked. Like, all of his contemporaries like him a lot. And this is what he's experiencing. You can only imagine somebody who is not in the public eye, what they're going through.
Yeah. It's, I guess, I think we could probably liken it to someone like, maybe like a Louis Armstrong or something. Like, here's someone who's definitely respected in their field, but still, society still says, well, hey, you might be, this great musician, but we're still going to treat you badly because of the color of your skin.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know. I bring it up just because I don't think it's particularly ended, but it's sometimes worth just making the notation of, as we talk about famous people, I don't know if I have a good point here. But
well, it's just that it's something that is very much glossed over and not mentioned. Like here we have this author who, if you had to ask someone, rifle off a few classic novels off the top of your head, at least 2, 3 of those would be from this guy here, but they deal almost nothing with race, and a lot of people don't have have no idea that this heritage that he has. So I think it's just important to just acknowledge that right off the bat.
So we're coming into his later years. So he's had his great successes, but now he has broken pathways, right, with his collaborator. He never changes his political opinion, so he's very happy about the Revolution of 1848. That's right. There's another one. He lives through all of these.
Yeah.
And then in 1850, he has founded a theater, and that theater fails. That theater almost exclusively showed his own plays, which is a pretty great move, but it does fail. Not because of his plays, it was just financial stuff. Napoleon III takes power in 1852, and he goes to Belgium to escape some issues with cash, nothing to do with the change of the guard there. He has no money, but his secretary actually manages to fix some things while he's away. I'm going to show you a picture of him towards the end of his life. This one's going to look like the one that you're a little more familiar with, although it's not the picture that I think you're thinking of. So daguerreotype.
Oh yeah, there he is. He's looking. It's a photographic portrait, first of all, and he's got a mustache. He's looking very distinguished. He's clearly older, but looking, just not serious, but he looks very dignified. I would say he's wearing a bow tie. He's looking very. It's a good photograph. It's a distinguished photograph, I would say.
Sepia tone, right? So
yes, yeah.
He goes, unfortunately, because of his money situation, he returns to a state of living much like his childhood towards the end of his life. He's in a small cottage. He doesn't have a lot of extra, but he has his children who he loves and are surrounding him, especially his son. And it is reported that the eve of his death, he asked his son, Alexandre Dumas, if his works would live on, and his eldest child convinces him that it would, and the older man's face lit up.
Aww.
And he wasn't lying. His son absolutely told him the truth. His works have lived on very, very strongly.
Yeah.
I do want to talk a little bit about his internment. So he dies in 1870. He is 68 years old.
Okay.
Assumed he died of natural causes. They think maybe a heart attack, but clearly he wasn't well because he kind of knew he was going towards the end. He's buried in his birthplace, and his death is kind of overshadowed in the news because the Franco-Prussian War has begun. So here's the thing about that. If I just told you that alone, you'd be like, yeah, that makes sense, right?
Yep.
Except that in France, they're very, very big on burying their famous people in big famous places.
Oh.
So there's like specific mausoleums where they bury famous writers.
Oh, okay.
And he is not there until 2002.
Oh, wow.
The bicentenary of Dumas' birth, the then French president Jacques Chirac holds a ceremony honoring the author by having his ashes reinterred at the mausoleum of the Pantheon of Paris, where a lot of other French luminaries are buried. And Chirac acknowledges that racism has existed in France and that the interment in the Pantheon has been a way of correcting that wrong. Dumas is enshrined alongside Victor Hugo and Émile Zola. He's in the same room as Hugo, which is important because he and Hugo were friends throughout their lives.
Yeah.
Hugo always held himself a little bit above Dumas because in his mind, Dumas wrote like silly little adventure stories.
Yeah.
And Hugo wrote big serious books.
Yeah.
Personally, I would rather read a Dumas book any day.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But they were always close, and Victor Hugo, after Dumas died, wrote a very beautiful letter to Dumas' son praising him. So the fact that they were finally kind of reunited in death was a big deal.
Yeah.
Schrock also noted that although France has produced many great writers, none have been as widely read as Dumas. In fact, altogether, so I told you about the Three Musketeers, I told you about the Count of Monte Cristo. Altogether, his novels have been translated into almost 100 languages and have inspired more than 200 movies. Which I think he would have loved, because he writes very cinematically. I think he would have loved to, and he was a playwright, so I think a movie would have made him incredibly happy.
Oh yeah, for sure.
In fact, he was so prolific that as recently as 2009, they were still finding some of his unpublished or forgotten works. So in 2009, they actually released something that they found in the basement.
Wow.
So the last additional note I'll just make is that Alexander Dumas Fils, Dumas' son, does also go on to be himself to be a very successful writer, and he's better with his money, so he dies pretty rich and pretty famous. So that's the story of 3 Alexander Dumas.
Yeah.
What do you think, Joe?
Well, I think it when you know more about his life, you definitely understand the themes in a lot of the stories. I would say, especially like if you wanted to relate it back to the Count of Monte Cristo, just the whole the power fantasy about getting revenge on those who have wronged you. So, we have all these things: wrongful imprisonment. People who want to do him in. Rising very high in the ranks very quickly, and getting these enemies and people conspiring against you. I think that point you made about Dumas being very much an influencer of his day, I think is very correct. I think he kind of knows what people wanted to see, and also enjoyed kind of living in that glamorous life, in society life. When you read something, like the Three Musketeers or the Count of Monte Cristo, there's all these intrigues with royalty and society. And we still kind of have that today. I think people want to peek in on that.
Oh yeah.
So there is that aspect. Like I said, there's the whole basically the money and power fantasy. One of the biggest themes. What would you do if you suddenly came into all of this money? How would you spend it? And now that we know he's such a bon vivant, we can really understand the stories. I think it gives you another angle when you're going through one of those classic novels the next time to kind of remember to keep in mind.
Oh yeah, one of the things I thought about beyond the obvious, wish fulfillment of his father.
Yeah.
In the Three Musketeers, literally all the Musketeers have mistresses.
Yeah.
Like they all have some woman in the background that they're not married to.
Yeah. It's, definitely writing from experience, and who doesn't like a little intrigue?
Yeah.
Like that. It's always a little spicier, right? When there's an illicit relationship going on.
I think it just goes to show you that we as people are. To me, he feels like a very 1800s James Patterson kind of writer. He's writing the things people want to read about. There are these quick moving books where there's a lot of action, and they were serialized, so they're very exciting, and he's hooking you from chapter to chapter. And the morality is very clear, who you're going to root for is very clear. I don't know. I think there's just something very cool about how immortal stuff is. And I think it's why it's endlessly adapted. Who doesn't want to watch a movie about 3 guys who are extraordinarily gifted with swords, who meet a 4th guy who's young, who they have to explain everything to? So you have your audience surrogate and D'Artagnan.
Yeah.
And they run around having adventures. They're superheroes. The Musketeers are superheroes.
That's true. Yeah, when you think about it, it's like he was definitely tapping into all of these things that we would probably, peg towards modern people who we would call influencers or creators, but he was definitely one in his age, and he knew how to, like you said, he knew how to market himself, and he definitely put himself out there, and he knew what his audience wanted as well. And it definitely, he was able to kind of take these things and adapt them. And it's not ideal when you're discriminated against, but hey, if you can use your life experience and your family's life experience and turn it around into something, then good for you. And obviously he's, you know, one of the most celebrated authors of all time, I would say. So
yeah, I would agree.
He definitely was able to use his life experiences. And I think now, you know, the next time we go to read one of those classics, the next time we pick one up, I think we can all, knowing what we know now, because we learned so much today, we can all have a better appreciation of it.
I hope so. But for now, I think our next episode, I have an unreleased episode with Karen Ostertag about cozy romances, sweet romances that I have to put out. So that'll probably be next. But for now, have a great day, everybody, and thanks for listening. And remember, read on.